Hey everyone, welcome to another G News podcast. Today we are very lucky to be joined by Professor Robert Patman, who is a distinguished professor in international relations, US foreign policy, global security at Otago University. Robert is very distinguished. He's a Fulbright scholar, the author of over a dozen books. His latest book is titled New Zealand's Foreign Policy Under the Jacinda Ardern Government. Welcome to G News, Robert.
Good morning, Gerald. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. You recently wrote an article in The Conversation where you stated that New Zealand's initial response to the situation in Venezuela seemingly falls short when it comes to making it absolutely clear where New Zealand stands. Could you comment about what happened on January the 3rd, what New Zealand's position was, and what you actually think of it?
Well, yes, the United States, the events of the 3rd of January were foreshadowed by an American military build-up in the waters adjacent to Venezuela. Something like 8 US naval vessels were deployed since September 2025. And then, I think many of our viewers will be aware, there were a series of military strikes against small boats, which were largely crewed by Venezuelans. They were alleged to be drug running, although, as analysts have pointed out, that's improbable because each boat would probably have to be refueled 20 times before they could get to the United States. In other words, there was a degree of concern about the killing of more than 100 people in these small boat incidents. But that set the scene for an intervention that occurred in which Nicolas Maduro and his wife were extracted, some might say kidnapped or abducted, taken back to the United States to face charges in New York. The charges are largely drug-related, although he's also facing an additional charge of relating to carrying automatic weapons, which seems quite curious in the context of Americans' gun laws. But putting that to one side, the bulk of the charges are on drug running. Again, the interesting thing here is that some American legal analysts have speculated this might be the case is going to be heard in New York, and it's not a slam dunk that Maduro will be found guilty, because it's no secret that the majority of the drugs, such as fentanyl, which are coming into the United States, are not coming from Venezuela. They're actually coming from through organised crime groups in China and also Mexico. So, in a sense, depending on how skilled Maduro's legal counsel is, it's going to be an interesting situation to play out. Clearly, so the reason there's been some concern internationally about what the Americans did is, first of all, what the Americans did was in contravention of their own laws, federal law. And the second thing was that, with respect to the federal, I should just clarify that point. With respect to the US federal law, under the Constitution, the President is supposed to consult with Congress. There was the 1973 War Powers Act, in which specified quite explicitly that consultation should occur. But there were briefings between the Trump administration and members of Congress, but regime change was never discussed during those briefings. So the events of the 3rd of January, when Maduro was abducted, came as a shock to many members of Congress, including those who were on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So internationally, this was a flagrant breach of international law. There's two key principles. There's a number of principles. First of all, the UN Charter prohibits the interference of one state in the internal affairs of another unless there was a clear threat to peace and security in the region and to the United States itself. There's no evidence that Venezuela was threatening the national security of the United States in any objective sense before the events occurred that we're talking about. The other thing here to note is that the Trump administration trampled on two key principles in international relations. One is respect for state sovereignty. The other one is respect for territorial integrity. So, in a sense, and the breaches of international law have actually increased in the aftermath of the incident, because Mr. Trump not only simply, he might have been forgiven had he extracted Maduro and then said to the Venezuelan government, well, that's it, we're finished, we've got the guy we wanted, you go along and look after the way you want to arrange your society. That would have been a breach in itself, of course. But Mr. Trump subsequently announced in a press conference within 24 hours of the operation that his administration would be effectively running Venezuela until, as he put it, a safe transition could be navigated, or words to that effect. So, in a sense, the reason there's considerable unease about this internationally, not least amongst America's liberal democratic allies, is that the administration seems to be acting on the principle that might is right. It's certainly acting in a way which is a clear departure, not for the first time, I should add, for this administration, a clear departure from what we in New Zealand call the international rules-based order, sometimes called the liberal order. That's a vision of international relations that all New Zealand governments have had since 1945, is that the idea that the world should be organised around laws, rules, and procedures and principles. And this vision of international relations, which all New Zealand prime ministers have held since 1945, basically believes passionately in the rule of international institutions like the United Nations, and believes in the norm of multilateralism, that states should cooperate together to solve problems that face them. So this unilateral action by the United States doesn't sit comfortably with the worldview of most of America's key allies, including New Zealand.
We actually heard some countries come out and say they condemned these actions, but New Zealand and I might say some of the countries that we're a little bit close to kind of said something a little bit weaker than that. They were concerned. Do you have a comment to make about the level of our position and whether it did fall short a little here?
Well, I think New Zealand's position did reflect the view of many European countries which said they disapproved of the operation but had no time for Maduro. But you can't have international laws and make exceptions like that. There's many countries we don't like. For example, as President Zelensky pointed out, why isn't President Trump extracting President Putin out of the Kremlin and bringing him to trial in the United States? Of course, you could make a case he shouldn't do that because Mr. Putin is not threatening the United States directly. But the point is that where do you draw the line? The whole idea of international law is it's supposed to have international, universal applicability. And there seems to be a selectivity who the United States wants to go after. Yeah, I mean, it's the New Zealand response was measured. Mr. Peters did uphold he expected all parties to conform with international law. I think he said that on the 4th of January, which was a fair comment. We all hope they will, but they clearly hadn't. So what do we do when parties who we hope conform with international law don't? Do we remain silent? And, you know, one thing that we must be very clear on here, Gerard, is that the operation in Venezuela caught public attention, but it wasn't a one-off. The Trump administration, since the beginning of January, when the second Trump administration, has been taking an international stance which is hostile to the international rules-based order. New Zealand and many other liberal democracies, including the UK and Australia, have taken a softly approach. I referred to this in the article on 5th of January that you referred to. The calculation was understandable on one level. New Zealand was trying to protect its interests. We knew this was a protectionist government, and we hoped by pulling our punches on Mr. Trump's threats, illegal threats against Canada, threatened to invade Canada in January, and of course continued to threaten to annex Greenland. We have said little about that in public, but these are key allies of our country. Canada is one of the oldest partners and allies of New Zealand. We've also said nothing, very little, about Mr. Trump's repeated threats to own Greenland and saying we must have it. This is totally unacceptable. Do we remain quiet on these issues? And I'm not making the case that New Zealand should react to everything Mr. Trump says and does. Indeed, where our interests converge, we should embrace that and work with the administration. But I don't think we should take a step back when the administration is assaulting our fundamental interests. Countries like New Zealand rely heavily on an international rules-based order. Rules are there for the weak, not for the strong. But when the strong start ripping up the rules, it has big implications for us in trade. We trade with more than 100 countries around the world. We need a stable and predictable environment to operate in. So, you know, I think we've reached a point where we've tried a softly approach, and that clearly has not worked. In fact, it had failed before the Venezuela episode. It failed by December when the Trump administration released its national security strategy document, which basically confirmed that the administration rejected the international rules-based order, and Mr. Trump's vision of how the world should be run is based on a concert of great powers. In other words, it's back to the future. Mr. Trump is looking to the model of how Europe was run during the 19th century, and he's made a few additions. He said that the world should be run by great powers in the 21st century. America, of course, in his words, would be at the top of the table, but alongside US would be other great powers like China and Russia, although whether Russia's a great power with an economy the size of Spain is another matter. And then, of course, there would be, at least in Mr. Trump's words, there would be India and Japan. So those 5 countries would, in Mr. Trump's vision, effectively run the world, which is bad news for middle powers and small powers, because we're clearly, if they're running the world, we'll clearly be left, the UN will be sidelined, and multilateral institutions, which we depend on, will be sidelined. So it will be a pretty unpredictable environment, and quite an unforgiving one for a relatively small power like New Zealand. So why do I mention this? I think we've got to a point in our foreign policy, we've tried to pursue a tactful, below the radar, softly approach. We've pulled our punches, and that's been noticed, by the way, internationally. People have noticed that New Zealand didn't speak up in defence of Canada. They noticed that we weren't forthright in condemning the trashing of international law in Gaza. And that came as a surprise to many international observers, because they always thought New Zealand was a brave little country that stood up for what's right. So we sometimes in this country assume that people don't know what's going on in New Zealand, but they do. We're an interconnected world. They see it, they applaud us when we do things well, but they also notice when we drop the ball. So we've got to make some tough foreign policy decisions in the near future. Do we carry on trying to coax and nudge an administration which does not share the same values and interests as this country? And
you actually made that comment in your article where you said we're approaching a kind of a moment of reckoning where we either stay close to the United States or kind of bat more for this rules-based order that we rely on. But we couldn't credibly do both. So, could you comment on that?
Yeah, because sometimes commentators in New Zealand act as if New Zealand is small and powerless. It's not. We're an interconnected world, and we have something called soft power. Up till recently, we've had a very good international reputation, particularly in the aftermath of the Christchurch terror atrocity, the 15th of March, 2019. when many countries around the world admired the way the government of the day, which happened to be led by Jacinda Ardern, reacted to what was our 9/11. 51 New Zealanders murdered by a white supremacist, brutally murdered in two mosques in Christchurch. The government reacted with a combination of empathy but also decisive action, banning automatic weapons. That won the admiration of many people around the world. So, and that led to what was called the Christchurch Call, which was a sort of bottom-up multilateral initiative launched by the Ardern government of France, which more than 50 countries almost immediately signed up to. What was that initiative? To curb online extremism. Now, much of that work has been undone because we've had a change of ownership in Twitter, for example, and one of the first things Elon Musk did was to sack all those people hired who were trying to filter out online extremism in the name of expanding the frontiers of freedom. But I do think the reason I said that in the article is we have to be very careful. We've signed up in the last year. We've made a series with the Defence Minister Judith Collins. We've strengthened our military ties to the United States. That's fine if the United States is continuing to share our values and interests. But the United States has a under Mr. Trump, and we have to be really clear-eyed about this, Gerard. We can't, I hear politicians talking about the United States sometimes as if they're talking about the Obama administration or even the first Trump administration. But this is the second revisionist Trump administration. It rejects the idea of international law. Mr. Trump said explicitly with 4 reporters from the New York Times last few days, said that nothing will act as a constraint on his freedom of autonomy in foreign policy except his own conscience, which may not be reassuring to many people considering he's a convicted felon. So he certainly doesn't see international law as a constraint. And so that's why I said we have to be clear-eyed about our interests. And that means that New Zealand may have to increasingly focus on those countries which share our value for free trade. Something I haven't mentioned but is very important. And the reason I said that the softly approach had failed towards the United States, it did not prevent 15% tariffs being imposed on New Zealand exports to the United States, which is a travesty of justice when you think New Zealand has one of the most open economies in the world, and America pays about 0.3% tariffs on its exports to this country. So we were, all that restraint that we exercised in the first 12 months didn't register with the administration. And I think we have to be robust about defending the country's national interests. And that means seriously looking at deepening relations with Canada, Australia, other liberal democracies which share our basic views of the world. It doesn't mean cold shouldering the United States, but effectively it means looking after our own interests and putting our energy into areas where we have partners that share those interests. Countries like Japan, Scandinavian countries, Europe. We already have a free trade agreement with Europe, and we have a free trade agreement with the UK. And I think many other liberal democracies are facing this moment. The West, as we known it, is over. And we have to come to terms with that. And some people are comforting themselves by saying, look, all we've got to do is keep our heads down. Mr. Trump will go from office eventually in the next few years, and then America will be back to normal. Actually, we can't afford to wait, because Mr. Trump is taking steps internationally which directly harm our international and national interests. And that is why I said you can't continue to consider yourself to be a very close ally of the Trump administration and also in at the other side of your mouth say you support a rules-based order, because he doesn't. And this is the most powerful country in the world. So this is a time where we have to make tough choices. I think it was Edmund Burke once said, in politics, there are often times when you have to make choices between the intolerable and the disagreeable. And we have to make up our mind which is the intolerable. For me, the ripping up of the rules-based order, my God, it's already in trouble as it is the intolerable outcome for New Zealand. We want to see small countries like New Zealand and middle powers like Australia grow in influence, not weaken. And
we seem to have been very weak about. You were talking about international law and Trump's view that he rejects it. It's just his conscience. We were weak about Israel's violation of international law in Gaza and the West Bank. We've refused to recognise a Palestinian state. And you were saying, we've been very reluctant, haven't we, to question Trump's trade protectionism. And we've been very, very, very quiet also around Iran and what's going on in Iran at the moment as well. We saw military strikes there last year, and Winston was waiting around for proof that, things had happened, but that kind of petered out. Could you comment for our audience what we're seeing today around that civil unrest in Iran, the instability there, and what the possible impacts on New Zealand could be if that develops into a broader kind of conflict?
Yeah, I mean, the situation in Iran, I think it's been a crisis waiting to happen for a long time. But I think the effects, the reverses for Iranian foreign policy in the Middle East, and also the cumulative impact of the reimposition of sanctions, has conspired to undermine the legitimacy further of the clerical regime in Tehran. And what we're now witnessing, of course, an appalling situation where the clerical regime the mullahs, as some people call them, have dug in and seem to be prepared to shed a lot of blood to stay in power. Mr. Trump is talking about intervening to support the protesters. I'm not sure that will help. That may even legitimize the clerical regime, which always likes a foreign adversary so it can crush the aspirations of self-determination for their own people. It's a very dangerous situation. Iran is a big country, 94 million people. 60% of the population is under 25, which means that the regime there was always facing, I think, long-term problems. But there's no doubt about it that recent events, particularly the fact that Iran had a number of proxies or allies in the Middle East, all of whom have suffered significant defeats military defeats at the hand of Israel, not necessarily political defeats, but certainly military reverses. Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hamas also was equipped to some degree, by a substantial degree, by Iran. Now, Iran wasn't doing that necessarily to help the Palestinian people. Iran sees itself to some degree in competition with Saudi Arabia for being the dominant influence in the Middle East. And you also have a clash within a sort of a split within the Islamic world between the Shia and Sunni. And this is a Shiite regime in Iran. So there's undercurrents there of rivalry within the Middle Eastern world, and also, of course, the United States relationship with Iran has been very strained for a long time. The tragedy about the current situation is that I think the Trump administration was wrong to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. It certainly hasn't stopped progress towards nuclear weapons, as Mr. Trump claimed it would. And yeah, I mean, my concern is that while Mr. Trump said he will intervene to help the protesters, that may be the intention, but will it? America's not going to send troops, I think, to Iran. So what's it going to do in terms of military intervention? It may bomb. strategic facilities belonging to the regime. But will that intervention actually help? I think one of the stories of the post-Cold War era is that military power of great powers is much more limited than they seem to think it is. I was thinking back to the US invasion of Iraq, which was illegal in 2003. And the administration declared victory after toppling the regime, I think by May 2003. Within 2 months they were declaring victory. But that turned out to be a full-blown insurgency. So I'm wondering to what extent, if America does intervene in some shape or form in Iran, that in turn could blow back on those it's trying to help. Because one of the narratives the administration, the Ayatollah Khamenei's regime is trying to put across is that all the protesters are agents of foreign powers, such as the United States and Israel. But by intervening, in a sense, you strengthen that narrative. And that is a danger. But it is a very worrying situation. And it's appalling that Iran has been so badly governed for so long. There's enormous corruption there, which Israel and the United States is not responsible for. And we've got to be very clear on this. And so the regime is in trouble for domestic reasons. And that's why so many Iranians are protesting. And of course, the economy, this should be a relatively rich country. It's got considerable resources, not least oil, but it's got other resources as well. And it's clearly struggling. And people can't get the basics. And that's why I think people have just had enough. And that's why you're getting hundreds of thousands of people protesting in multiple Iranian cities. But, recent reports suggest, I heard from a contact recently, someone who's got good information about Iran, that up to 12,000 people have been killed who are protesting, peacefully protesting. Now, I don't know if that number is how accurate it is, but it's clearly a pretty grim situation, and it has reverberations for the Middle East. But yeah, I've been very demoralised by how limp the Western world have been generally in being quiet on the situation in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, all the Western countries want a two-state solution, whereas we have an Israeli leader, Mr. Netanyahu, who rejects a two-state solution, and yet countries like Australia, countries like the UK, countries like the United States, particularly the US, have generously provided Israel with weapons for a purpose which they disapprove of, which is the building of a greater Israel. So I do not quite understand. I cannot find many parallels in history where countries have given arms to another actor in the international system for purposes they do not explicitly approve of. So, all this has created turmoil in the Middle East to some degree. And I would not be surprised if there is regime change in Iran in the not too distant future. But let's hope that the Iranian people can decide their own future.
Thanks for that, Robert. When it comes to Latin America, US foreign policies have long been involved in kind of domination and regime change, as far as I understand it, down that way. But recently, you've seen China invest a lot in the economic interests there. Can you comment on the possible reactions if this Donro doctrine goes a bit further into Latin America from the likes of China?
Yeah, I think it's partly a response to China's growing global economic role. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. I mean, China is legitimately a second superpower, has had that status from about 2010. It's the second biggest economy in the world after the United States. And it's now, its economy is reprioritizing its economy. It's gone from a big emphasis on manufacturing. China's still responsible for about a third of the world's manufacturing. But it's also now targeting high-tech priorities like AI artificial intelligence, and it seems to be making quite strong progress. They have, as part of this process of becoming a superpower, because they've been a successful exporter, they've sought to push into regions where previously they haven't been involved, which includes Latin America. And so the United States, I think, has become sensitive to that. The problem for the United States is even those readers who are right-wing and support Trump is that while they may agree politically with Mr. Trump, they probably will not welcome the curbing of their sovereignty by a United States which claims a special role over them, which through the eyes of most people in South America and Latin America looks like the reinvigoration of some sort of colonialism or imperial role. Mr. Trump said quite explicitly, and it's all down in the National Security Strategy document, that the United States is seeking to dominate, quite explicitly, the Western Hemisphere. This is a sort of return to a sort of spheres of influence idea that the concert of powers had. Because the slightly worrying implication is that does that mean Mr. Trump is quite happy for China to dominate much of Indo-Pacific if they keep out the Western Hemisphere? Does it mean that Mr. Putin is free to try to dominate Europe? So there's some disturbing undercurrents there. But I think the crucial thing is I can't see this working, Gerard. People, even small countries, they're just as nationalistic. They feel just as strongly about the specialness of their country as big countries. For example, Kiwis, we quite rightly believe we have an exceptionally good country. And it's got a stable political system. It's got some remarkable physical features. And it's got a lot going for it. So I don't think countries like Chile and others are going to accept this vision. And without acceptance, it's not going to work, because the United States then faces choices. If countries reject American dominance, they have to enforce it. How do they do that? They have to use military power. Well, I don't think Americans want to become the world's police officer. And by the way, that's one of the reasons Mr. Trump was elected, because he promised to end what he called forever wars. So it may have a sort of feel-good factor talking about re-establishing American dominance, but we must distinguish between declaratory policy and substantive policy. And I'm very sceptical there will be buy-in from many countries in South America saying, oh yes, we want to be under the control of the United States. That's not going to be a vote winner for many South American politicians who jealously guard their sovereignty and their sense of national identity like any other country.
Okay, Robert, look, finally, I'm just going to ask two quick questions to end this interview. What kind of foreign policy would you like New Zealand to move further towards in the future? And how uncertain and volatile do you feel the world is right now while we're heading into an election year in 2026?
I think we should pursue what I call a two-track approach with the United States, the world's most powerful country. But more generally, I think we should be doubling our efforts to build bridges with middle powers and small powers. And they are the majority. More than 180 countries come into that category of 193 countries in the UN. And why do I say this? You might say, well, that's all very idealistic and not realistic. We have to be on good terms with the great powers. Actually, that's not true. In the 21st century, great powers have less autonomy. They're stronger than ever, but they have less ability to shape the world. Why? First of all, this process, globalization, this process of technological driven interconnectedness, which is making the world a smaller place and connecting us in ways we haven't been connected before. But the big reason, which is kind of related to globalization but slightly different, is that most of the major problems we face, whether they be climate change, whether they be transnational terrorism, whether they be pandemics, whether they be financial and economic contagion flowing from an integrated or interconnected global economy, none of those problems respect borders. And therefore, that means those problems are too big for great powers to fix. And so that means the middle powers and the small powers must be part of any solution to address those problems. And therefore, in the 21st century, I believe there is every prospect for small powers like New Zealand and middle powers having a greater say in international politics. It's not because great powers are weaker, it's just that the problems are too big for them to solve on their own. And one thing we should be doing as a small country is reiterating something that Peter Fraser identified back in the period when he was Prime Minister between 1940 and 1949. He was very uncomfortable about the use of the veto, the introduction of the veto, went along with it, because he then assumed quite correctly that great powers could solve most of the world's problems, and therefore he went along with them having a veto. Fast forward 80 years, that's over. The United States and China collectively could not fix climate change. Those problems can only be solved by self-interested international cooperation, and that means the middle powers and the small powers must get together and get organised and say to the holders of the veto in the Security Council, we do not want this to continue. Because after all, at the moment, we live in a world where 5 countries determine matters of peace and war for everyone. That's unacceptable. And it's the majority that actually bear the costs of this veto privilege. So I would like to see New Zealand working closely together, put pressure to reform the UN Security Council, make it more functional, and for New Zealand to make its position clear on issues which do not respect borders, like climate change. And I do think we've got as a country, we've got tremendous potential to constructively contribute to solving some of those problems that we're facing. And we're facing some really pressing problems. We have a president at the moment who's pretending, or maybe he believes it, that climate change is a hoax. But that position will not be maintained much beyond the Trump administration. So we can, as Joe Louis once said about his opponents in the boxing ring, they can run, but they can't hide. Those problems we've just identified. We can run from them, but climate change, global pandemics, transnational terrorism, problems of economic contagion, they're not going away. So sooner or later, we have to be brave and face them. And I believe that the first step in doing that is for New Zealand to be clear-eyed about where its interests are and to work closely with those countries that share those interests.
Robert Patman, thank you very much for that very valuable contribution, and I'm sure it's going to be very well received by everybody out there today. Thank you for your expertise, and we'd love to have you back again to talk more about the big picture and what's going on outside our shores and where New Zealand's voice is when it comes to those big matters that just won't go away. Thank you very much for your comments today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah, right.